Hi, hi. It's Joy Foster, founder of Tech Pixies and the host of the Sparkle and Thrive podcast. And I'm really very, very interested in this conversation that we're about to have. And I hope you are too. We have the lovely Maria Wybrow with us, who is a Tech Pixie alum and is doing some incredible work in the codependency recovery space. And if you've never heard of codependency before, you're not the only one. It's a term that I have only recently become familiar with when someone suggested that I read a book called Codependent No More. So I'm a huge fan of understanding what codependency is and understanding how it affects you. So, Maria, thank you for coming on to talk about this really important topic. One of the things I love about Tech Pixies is that people do all sorts of different things and have all sorts of different backgrounds and different expertise. And then once they learn how to use social media, they become more visible. They talk about those things and they really become experts in that area. And you are an expert on codependency. So let's start by saying, welcome to the podcast. And could you please tell us what codependency is from your perspective?
Yeah. Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to read out Tian Dayton describes codependency a lot better than I can. So I'm just going to read that out first and then we can dive in. So it's a trauma related loss of self that happens slowly throughout our personality development. It's fear based and a predictable set of qualities and behaviors that grow out of feeling anxious and therefore hypervigilant in our intimate relationships. But it's also reflective of an incomplete process of us becoming an individual. So that's the long winded technical term. I like to describe codependency is the abandonment of self in a nutshell. And where does it come from? I mean, you're talking my whole life, Joy, has been overcoming a very traumatic childhood that was covered up. And this is where it comes from. It comes from dysfunctional families. There is a bit of confusion though around codependency because Melody Beattie in the 80s, she worked at treatment centers, as you may know, in Minnesota in the US. And she noticed that everyone coming in to the treatment center, their partner, not necessarily the addict, but their partners displayed the same behaviors. And hence the term codependency was coined. However, that was in the 80s. So everybody thinks codependency is addiction. And it is definitely where there's addiction, there is definitely codependency. Even clients who I work with say, oh no, there's no addiction in my family. We get working together and then I find out the grandparent or if somebody has an addiction but they don't do it anymore. So that's partly confused the conversation for those who maybe didn't grow up with addiction or have no recollection or memory of being around addiction growing up. So if we hold that for a second, but you will be codependent if you grew up in a dysfunctional family. So what is a dysfunctional family? Well, I have been appalled since I've started to work as a coach that some people do not realize what a dysfunctional family is. So a dysfunctional family can be certainly a household where there's addiction, particularly if there's no recovery. And I grew up in one of those households. Or a household where there's a mental illness or emotionally immature parents who weren't ready for the commitment of parenthood, as you probably understand, such a big commitment. Or where there's domestic violence. And people go, yeah, I get a dysfunctional family, is violence, addiction, immature parents. But you can also be growing up in a dysfunctional family where there's neglect. And I work with people where they say, Maria, my parents had really good jobs, they earned lots of money, I had a great education, but yeah, they neglected me emotionally. They didn't mean to, but I was neglected because they were busy working, trying to provide for you. So when people hear this, I get their attention. Because if you grew up with violence or you grew up with abuse or you grew up with addiction, you've probably cottoned on from a very young age that it was dysfunctional. But what's more subtle is the neglect piece, but also generational trauma, which you hear a lot about on social media. And it's not because your parents maybe were in the generational trauma, but they have responses to growing up with parents. So anyone whose parents or grandparents that were around the World War II segment, there will be trauma. So you react, you've had to grow up with their reaction to growing up with trauma. And that's how it's brought down into the generations. So that's where it comes from. And I've been astounded working with people who thought, well, I didn't really grow up with a lot of trauma. I didn't grow up with any trauma. My family isn't dysfunctional, but they've got all the signs and symptoms of codependency. Then when we dig a bit deeper, their denial, it's quite shocking. I worked with one client who's Russian, and her father was very vocal. She's probably in her 40s. Her father was very vocal in Russia about the regime there, and it was big into education, was a professor, and he had to leave his job for fear of death and had to then take employment undercover where he wasn't as visible to protect him physically. And even though he had employment for most of her childhood doing something completely different to what he trained to do, there was always this issue of safety. And if he came out from being undercover, so to speak, that he'd be killed. And I remember saying to this client, and you don't think that's traumatic
Mhm.
or dysfunctional? It's okay, they didn't beat you, they didn't sexually abuse you, they were as available to you as they could. But that piece of your childhood, you don't think that was traumatic
Mm,
for you and for them.
mm,
So that's where codependency comes from. It's not just families with addiction, and I know all about them because I grew up with that.
mm,
But the thing is, there's only four key components for a dysfunctional family, and that's a culture of silence. So there's no atmosphere of discussing problems. So I always remember in my early recovery, I wasn't so bothered that my parents had issues that they had, but what really bothered me was they did nothing about it. So there's a culture of silence. So we don't discuss problems. So you don't learn that problems are okay and that you don't learn they can come to resolution. Um, so a culture of silence, emotions are punished or ignored. So you don't learn emotional regulation. It's very key in families with addiction. I didn't. I've literally had to learn that joy in midlife.
mm,
Um, so emotions are punished, ignored, and feelings you're not allowed to show your feelings, and your feelings aren't validated because if the family's in denial about whatever issues there. So, for example, I remember as a kid saying, "There's something wrong in this family." I'm being told to be quiet and shut up. So your feelings aren't validated, so you begin to mistrust them. And you are given age inappropriate responsibilities. So that can be anything from helping in the house, but where you're literally cooking meals and cleaning the house. Or like what I experienced was it's a form of emotional abuse where you're the confidant to the parent as a child. So the enmeshment and the boundary violation, with parent and child, and you're discussing your issues generally sometimes with the other parent or your life issues with your child. That's not appropriate. So age inappropriate responsibilities given to kids. So they're the four hallmarks. Surprises a lot of people.
Well, I think that is incredible what you've just said, because I do think people don't realize the extent of trauma and what counts as it and what doesn't count as it. I mean, I think I heard there's a great book that Oprah Winfrey wrote with a co-author. But one of the things they talked about was the scale of trauma. And there's a scale, and there's 10 points, and you get sort of 1 point for each trauma you've had in your life. And sort of a normal person might have one, two, but less than four. Most people have less than four. But once you go over six, then you have real dysfunction in your life, and it causes all sorts of problems. And it's really interesting because if you do this scale, and it's not a foolproof scale, but it just goes to show you that it doesn't take much to tip over four things in your life that would really lead to what would be a very challenging and tricky life. And she discovered this. It's not her tool, but when she discovered this tool, she had started a school for girls in Africa. And they would have, some of the girls have really strange behaviors where, like, they'd be in the middle of the classroom, they'd just stand up and start crying and leave the room. And she just didn't understand what was driving the behavior. And so when they started sort of checking them against this list of trauma that they could have, every single girl in her school had, six. They were on a scale of 6 to 10, and she herself, was on a scale of 6 to 10. She was, had a lot of trauma in her life. But the other thing that they have discovered with this the concept of trauma is that microaggressions repeated over and over and over and over and over again lead to the equivalent and the same feeling of a major trauma. So it doesn't, like you said, it's not that you have a major incident where you get beat up, but it's that every single day the comments, or the lack of the lack of care, that adds up. And it's like water dripping on a stone, and eventually that stone cracks, and people don't
Yeah.
recognize it. So let's talk about some of the things that you talked about, the sort of the four cornerstones of it, the things that identify whether or not you've got some codependency going on in your life. But what are the steps that you can take to deal, if you recognize, okay, actually I am codependent, and I'm showing some codependency traits, or I'm experiencing it, or and you may even realize, when I started reading the book Codependent No More, what I realized was I started to see other people in my life. I started to look at their behaviors and go, whoa, they're codependent. So it was interesting to me to recognize that there were some people in my life that were displaying behaviors that came out of trauma. I didn't know that and I was sort of going, my real thought was, I wonder what happened that I don't know about.
Mm,
What happened in that
yeah.
person's life that I don't know about, that's led them
Mm,
to have these behaviors. So it's a really interesting perspective when you read something and you go, wow, I someone I'm very close to is displaying all of these behaviors. So I guess the two questions I have there is, one, if you recognize that you're codependent, what can you do about it? But also, if you recognize people around you who you love, and know, and how do you support them in moving forwards on their codependency journey?
yeah, that's a very interesting observation. Well, what I normally say on Clubhouse, when I speak on Clubhouse, because obviously I don't go into massive detail there until, to really weed out who wants to do the work. But I think codependency is linked to denial, and the whole foundation of codependency is denying reality. It's like the coping mechanism. So I always say, first and foremost, even though it's painful, is to come out of denial. I've got these behaviors like people pleasing, caretaking, and maybe a history of being in toxic relationships, maybe even in a toxic relationship, wanting to leave, but just can't quite make that break, or not believing that I can survive after that relationship. Um, so the first thing I always say is denial. Come out of denial and make a commitment to yourself, because you're going to need that commitment. And because it's very sly and sneaky codependency. And I have to say, even though I diagnosed my own codependency at 32, I put myself in therapy at 30. I 12-step program at 30 also, so double whammy here. And by 32, I diagnosed my own codependency because of relationships. this is where it differs slightly to people pleasing. You'll always have issue with relationships with codependency. So that's what the peak, if we look at the iceberg, there's lots of stuff going on under the water, but one common denominator is the issue in relationships, whether it's with your partner, a member of a family, maybe one of your kids, or colleagues. And it becomes from the disease, the abandonment of self. So, top line, I say, for example, on Clubhouse, is make that commitment, but also start putting more focus and attention on you. How can you do that? Well, number one, stop people pleasing. So, how do we do that? Well, you're not going to stop immediately, but you could start by the next time you get a request, instead of going, yeah, and you then think about it later on that day and go, oh my God, I can't do this. You pause, you take a breath, and we go, I'll come back to you. Whilst you're in that in between time, we ask ourselves a few questions, and one or some of the, for example, do you really want to do this? Do you have the time to do this? Do you have the money to do this? And is this actually in line with you? So we pause. So we don't, anytime I get a request now, out of a habit, I always delay confirming. Pause. I'll come back to you. Number one. Number two, we could, when we're out and about, going about our daily lives, share a different opinion. So instead of just going along with the crowd, which is so easier to do, because the whole crux of codependency is we don't really know who we are. We're kind of second guessing ourselves all the time. We're looking to other people to validate ourselves. So practice maybe having a different opinion and share it respectfully, for example. We could also ask for help. That's one of the core issues with codependency is we don't want to ask for help. We've had to survive, and I really get this one. We've had to survive most of our lives, and that's what we've done. We've survived. We've not really lived where we've felt the joy and felt the pain. So when we're not feeling our feelings, that's what happens. We're in survival mode, and we close out joy and enjoyment. But um, you know, practice saying no, but also sharing a different opinion. Um, I'm a big, big proponent of journaling. If you want to get to know yourself, start journaling. And there's three reasons why journaling works. It's been scientifically proven. So gratitude, for example, what you're grateful for. And when you're codependent, I remember thinking, I have nothing to be grateful for. Zilch. Because of my inner critic was very loud, until I realized that voice isn't mine. That voice, that negative voice is my mother. It's not my voice. So journaling what I'm grateful for creates those new neural pathways. And I've seen it in my own life. I used to think I literally had nothing to be grateful for. I was so disconnected from me and my life, I couldn't see the good. It was just always a fog of bad and pain and issues. Issues. I've always got issues. And if I don't have an issue, there's people in front of me with issues that I've got to deal with because I had no boundary. I didn't realize that, guess what? My job in life is to look after me. And I say this to clients, burn that into your consciousness. Your job in life, unless you've got kids under 18, is to look after you. That's all you have to do. It sounds easy, but it's tough.
And I would
For
even
example,
argue that you've got to look after, if you've got kids under 18, you've still got to look after you, because one of the challenges is people forget about themselves and they don't take
yeah,
care of
yeah,
themselves. Yeah.
yeah.
That's really
But
interesting though. So that sign of people pleasing, if you find yourself people pleasing, that's a really good sign that you probably have some codependency going on. And when one of the things that we can do when you are finding yourself people pleasing is actually pausing and not saying yes, just saying let me get back to you, and having a moment to think about that and really asking yourself, why am I saying yes to doing this. The thought about the opinion, or having a different opinion, that's really interesting. What happens if you're in a situation where that sometimes the easiest road is to not have an opinion, because every time you have an opinion, there's never consensus, or it's like you're always talked out of that opinion. So I I would imagine that that's a sign of a codependent conversation, where you just don't even share your opinion because you don't want to go down that argument road.
Yeah, because as codependents, if you identify with codependency, we fear conflict and we fear rejection because we haven't learned to we haven't learned self-validation, and very often we haven't learned emotional regulation. So we fear if we share our opinion and it's different to everyone else, we'll be talked about, we'll be disliked, and heavens above, we might be rejected. But here's the thing, you probably won't, because very often it's not what we believe in, it's how we express it. So I always say, share respectfully that maybe you have a different point of view. You don't have to be confrontational. Most of us are fear confrontation, but it's the tone of a voice, but just practicing, um, but also stop being the martyr. And what I mean by that is a martyr is somebody who always complains they've too much to do and they don't have any help. But yet somebody offers them help that's safe, they reject. No, 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 no. And I say no. Pause. Remember, pause. Somebody's offering help, or they say person, yes. Well, maybe, maybe let them help. Nobody is successful and has a great life by doing everything themselves. And perfectionism, for example, shows up a lot with codependency. And if you are a perfectionist, you possibly grew up in an environment where you had to appear to be perfect to get maybe some love or validation or attention. So if we're a perfectionist, and I know because I am, less so today, but if we're a perfectionist, we can be very hard on ourselves, the inner critic, when we make a mistake. So show yourself more self-compassion. Even if it's just, hey, I've made a mistake, it's okay. And the other aspect of perfectionism, which is definitely tied into codependency that I wanted to mention, was expectation. Expectation of ourselves and an expectation of others. So I always expected everybody to be on top form, always to deliver, be there when I needed them. And it's not possible. It's not possible, or my schedule would be far too busy. So it wasn't, I was setting myself up to fail because it was not possible. But also, I didn't realize that I translated that onto others, like maybe my husband or somebody in the family. You must be perfect and get things right all the time and always deliver for me. It's not possible. Nobody can be perfect and available to you all the time, every day of the year. But the antidote to this is self compassion. And this is where the pausing and the taking a breath comes in also. Because if you pause, take a deep belly breath, sounds ridiculous, but you're telling your nervous system it's okay. So it's automatically showing yourself like some love and attention. You buy yourself that space to connect. Okay, I've made a mistake. If your inner critic kicks off, soften it. Soften it by going, okay, whose voice is that really? And is it the truth? My inner critic literally ran my life because I didn't know it was an inner critic. I just thought it was me. Just thought life is terrible. Everything feels terrible and everybody is terrible because that was my mother's journey. And my mother put a lot, what's the word, transferred a lot of her stuff onto me because I looked like her. And I inherited her strength and resource. But what I didn't inherit was her willingness to put up with crap. That was something I was very adamant in coming to the United Kingdom. I'm so grateful for it because I remember thinking, don't have to put up with crap. Because I'd see people over here and they weren't putting up with crap. and they were having a great time. I remember thinking, hey, I want some of that. But being more serious, getting back to the inner critic, you're not your thoughts. So I just presumed, Joy, I genuinely presumed I'm useless. I literally can't achieve anything. I can just kind of trudge along and cope until I realized the breakthrough for me was, hey, that's an inner critic. Whose voice is that? I remember doing work on myself and somebody saying, whose voice is that? And I remember thinking, I'm going to have to think about this. And then I realized, oh my gosh, it's my mother's voice. And then when I recognized, or I was helped to see, well, why do you think that voice is there? Is it the truth? And I remember thinking, hey, this isn't the truth. I can't be crap all the time. The law of averages are I'm going to succeed once, maybe out of 10 tries. And it was like such a big weight. And the inner critic is very harsh when we're codependent because we weren't given that love. Or no, I'm not saying that we weren't given that love, but we may not have been shown compassion
Mm,
growing up in those very informative years when our brains are like sponges. But we can reparent ourselves.
yeah.
And that's the crux of codependency recovery is uncovering the trauma and then healing from it. And then we learn to reparent. And what I love about this aspect of healing is you can reparent yourself. I thought, oh, it's too late. I'm midlife or I'm 30. At 30, I thought my life was over. I mean, I'm mid 50s and I realized my life's only just begun. Certainly my career life, it's only just begun. I've never felt so energized or happy and motivated in all my years on this planet. I'm in midlife, and the world is in free fall, but I'm not in free fall.
Well,
But the reparent,
I love so much about that. And, and Maria, you and I have been connected for a couple years now. And what was beautiful was watching you find your voice and really figure out where you wanted to go. In fact, and we'll talk about Clubhouse just for a minute here, because that's a place where you really did find your voice, was on Clubhouse. And when I do the social media crash course, I talk about the 8 different social media networks. And Clubhouse is one of the networks I talk about, which came out during the pandemic. It was a voice only network. So not video and pictures and all the other things that the other social networks had. But it was incredible watching you find your voice and figure out who you wanted to serve, how you wanted to serve them, what you wanted to do. And you've developed all of that. And a huge part of that was taking off your invisibility cloak, getting onto social media, starting to talk about things. Do you have a minute just to like talk about that journey for you?
yeah, and it's thanks to you, Joy, because I remember being sat at home in the pandemic. I was thrown out of my job. We all lost our jobs in the company I worked in at the time. Had to come home. Husband locked the door of the study. He says, I'm too busy, can't talk to you. I thought, I've no children. I don't have a dog. I've no job. What am I meant to do? What am I meant to do? So I go onto Facebook thinking, plod, plod, plod. What the hell is this? I thought Instagram was social media. Anyway, I went onto Facebook and I stumbled upon this American lady doing a challenge. I thought, what's a challenge? Into the club I went, or the Facebook, hadn't a clue how to use, and I met this British lady because everybody was American. She lived in Reading, and after that challenge, she said, "Oh, you've got to do Tech Pixies." And I said, "Who? What? Who?" And literally, I had zero clue on there. Who? What? Where? So she said, "Just, I'll send you the links. Follow me." And that girl, Karen, is the one who directed me to Tech Pixies. And I remember it was May 2020, and you were selling you were doing the challenge, which I fumbled about how to do a live, and I think my husband showed me, and you were selling. And I remember saying to Karen, how can she sell online? She's never met these people. That's literally, I had zero clue. But by the September, I totally got you. And I bought the program, as you know. And because I knew I needed to learn social media. I knew I didn't want to be a social media manager, but I knew I still needed to learn social media. And I loved the fact the course for the coaching aspect. I thought, yeah, I need that. So I need to learn something new and feel that my mind's being fed also.
And what's so incredible
And
now, you've found your voice, you've been able to share your story, you've been able to get it out there, you've been able to reach people, and now you are running your own coaching programs and connecting with people and helping them through their codependency. So if someone's listening to this and they're like, Maria is speaking a language that I did not know I needed to speak, and wants to work through their codependency and get some support through codependency recovery, how can you help them? How can you support them?
yeah, I mean, fundamentally, I offer three things. So I go on Clubhouse, and as I explain on Clubhouse, and Clubhouse is brilliant because for free you get market research. And most people, like I was, even if you get your codependent, there is such a myriad of therapies and modalities to choose from. Most people get lost. And with codependency, it's very niche, but also, in my opinion, it's very niche how you heal. So the therapy deals with the past, and some clients I work with do need to delve into that past. Coaching is about today and where you want to go in the future. But there's another aspect to codependency recovery that doesn't touch those two corners, in my opinion, because of my journey. So I went into therapy at 30, 12-step program. And still, by the time I was 38, 39, I'd made great progress. But I knew there was still gaps. And I couldn't figure it out. I remember thinking, I am busting my butt here on the treadmill of therapy, 12-step programs. There's still something missing. And that's the gap I fill. So you can do a one-to-one with me, or you can do 6 calls where I will give you the roadmap. And that roadmap is what you need to do, the areas you need to look at to heal. Now, some of it you can do with me, but I'll be honest, and I'll say to people, some of it you can't. But here's the thing. I spent 25 years plus going around in circles, not really getting what the hell I've got to do to overcome this. But with me in 6 calls, some people do them in 6 weeks, some people want to do them over 3 months. You'll get the roadmap. So I do mentoring and then I segue into coaching if they want it. But I feel that mentoring piece is important because, particularly in the last year, I've noticed on social media mental health big and people want answers like I did. But 20 years ago, there wasn't social media around. So if you look at some people on social media that are even bigger than me in the mental health arena, they all give free education. They sell a program or a membership, and that's where I'm heading as well. So you can work one-to-one with me the 6 weeks. The 6 weeks you're not going to be healed, but you know what you're going to need to do to heal. And then I haven't launched yet, but I've created my codependency recovery course. And I collaborated, as you know, with Krista in the US. I met her on coachu.com. So she's a director of online course creation at the university in Idaho. Plus, she does leadership development for female leaders. So when I was designing the course, she kept saying to me, when I collaborated with her, you've got to be able to prove, I know what you want to teach them. How are they going to learn it? And what tools you're going to use? So it's one-to-one coaching, the 6-week call. It'll blow your mind because I just wish somebody had said this to me 25 years ago. You
Yeah.
need to know the areas you've got to look at.
Well, I love the work that you're doing in the world, and I love that you found your voice and you figured out how to use social media to reach people that you've never met before so that you can share your message with them, but more importantly, so that they can get the healing that they need and deserve. And I hope people listening to this will take a lot away from that. Where can people find you online?
Yeah, mariawybrow.com.
And
So
that's
click on that. You can book it. Yeah, Maria Wybrow, Instagram, Maria Wybrow, and Clubhouse, Women in Business. That's the only club I go into now, women in business, because there's 400,000 members. And believe me, there's a lot of women in there who want to know about codependency.
And Wybrow, just so people know if you're listening, it's WYBROW, and it's Maria, Maria. And we will put the links in the show notes for you. I have to say, one of the things that I have started to say to people, there are certain traits that are really strongly tied to codependency. We talked a lot about them today. And so if any of the traits we talked about on this podcast resonate with you, it's something you should be looking into. And it is amazing how many people are impacted by this and how much of an effect it has on them. And it wasn't until someone said to me, you need to look into this for myself, that I started to understand what it was. And I've done the same thing for people that I know, that it might be a positive thing to pass on that news to them too. So if you listen to this podcast and you say, actually, I know someone that needs to listen to this podcast, please share it with them, because there's an important message in here that is really, and as Maria said, the language around this has only been in existence for about 40 years, and it's evolved quite a lot from what initially was tied into addiction and now is tied into trauma, and then even beyond trauma, sort of even that micro trauma. So there's it doesn't take much to recognize that there's a part of us that might be connected to codependency in some way, shape, or form. And that's the beauty of coaching, getting coaching, getting support, identifying what's going on, and being able to work through it with someone who has been there and gotten through the other side is so important. So, Maria, I really appreciate that you came on today to talk about this really important topic. And of course, for me, there's nothing better than to interview an expert within our own community. We have so much gold dust in the Tech Pixies community in terms of the skills and talents that we've brought together. So I'm just super grateful that you came on today, that you talked about this very important topic, and continue to do this amazing healing work that you're doing in the world. It's so valuable, so important, and I'm so grateful to you for doing it.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you for listening, and we'll catch you on the next podcast.